The man I will be introducing to you is seen as one of the most effective diplomats in the country. Yes, over the years, he's proven to be a dedicated public servant and a distinguished statesman. He's so much committed to the socio-economic development of his country. I am talking about His Excellency Bafo Eje Bewa, Ghana's ambassador to the United States of America. You're welcome to Diplomatic Affairs, sir.
Thank you very much. And at the risk of sounding too optimistic, may I wish your viewers a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thank you so much for joining us. I've been praying for this day for far too long.
Oh, is that right?
I'm happy you are finally here with us.
Sure.
Yes, we are going to talk about relations between Ghana and the United States of America. And of course, I mean, there is no one as better than yourself to tell us more when it comes to these two countries. You were appointed in 2017 as the 19th ambassador of Ghana to the United States of America.
Sure.
You've served in Japan, and of course, you've been to the United States. Let's talk about life before you became a diplomat, briefly.
Life before I became a diplomat? Well, I suppose after graduate school in the States, I came to lecture at Legon.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I went to work as the chief executive of the Ghana Tourist Board.
Mm-hmm.
Which also had some components with regard to being on the boards of Ghana Airways and other organizations. But then I resigned my job at the tourist board because I felt the working conditions at the time were a bit trying. And excuse me, when I resigned, I found myself in the 5th Battalion Guard room for 12 days, after which there was a lot of investigation and whatnot. And I was eventually told that nobody found anything negative about my stewardship or anything, so I could go back to work. And I insisted that the letter I originally wrote said I had quit. So I quit, and then I went to Britain. I went to Britain and then worked for, mostly in the education field. I was the head of access and development at the Hackney Adult Education Institute, head of business training for Iris College of Technology. And then I finally ended up at the Learning and at the last door, yeah, Learning and Access Development Agency for Britain, where basically what we did was to run courses, do research and development for all the further education colleges in England and Wales, at which time I was also doubling up as the chairman of the NPP in Great Britain. So when finally President Kufuor came into office, I was asked to go to Japan as the ambassador with concurrent accreditation in Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and Singapore. So that is where that is where my diplomatic, sort of life began, in one of the economically largest countries, in one of the most sophisticated countries, and between Japan, Singapore, and Australia, New Zealand, plus Papua New Guinea. It was a tough act, but we managed.
How did you manage through it all? Because I was going to come to that, language as a barrier and other factors playing out.
Well, as for the language, you try as much as possible to pick as much as you can. But the Japanese language is not one of the easiest to handle. In fact, the then ambassador of Ethiopia and I joined a Japanese language class, but our schedules were such that we weren't keeping up. So in the end, we became dropouts. But we tried as much as possible to pick, one or
the
two.
Basic ones.
Because usually a lot of ice is broken if there's a bit of
exactly.
familiar communication between between two individuals. Yeah, so it wasn't that bad. And also I had a secretary who was very good in English, very hardworking, very dedicated. And therefore, when it came to language support, I relied on her.
Interesting. You were in Japan for how many years?
The whole of President Kufuor's term, 8.
8 years. And then you had to be moved from Japan to the United States of America.
Yeah, that
Before I move to my
after
next
the
question,
heritage, yeah.
do you speak any Japanese, any of the languages?
Japanese? Oh, Scotch.
Just a little.
Just a wee bit.
I got that. I got that. It's very interesting. We'll be talking more about your career as a diplomat as we go along with our conversation. But first, let's shift our attention to business engagements between Ghana and the United States of America. Of course, whenever we had to talk about relations between Ghana and some of these big countries, the perception out there is that they are taking so much from us, as in they are giving us because they are helping us to grow our economy, grow the entire country, all the facets of the country. And so one doesn't really appreciate how much we are also helping them in also boosting the economy. First, let's establish which areas are we cooperating in together. What are the areas of cooperation between these two countries?
Well, I believe we seem to have developed some kind of posture that all that we do is to try and eke out some support from some of these countries.
Exactly.
And therefore, we tend to downplay what is it that we can contribute. Besides that, our consumer attitude is such that there's always a certain kind of preference for goods from the outside. And therefore, we don't do enough promotion of what is it that we can put on the other markets. Yeah. So far, we have been trying very hard to get the American consumer market to recognize some of the other things, that could be coming out of here. In fact, it's gratifying to know that there are lots of, Ghanaian enterprises, especially in the grocery area, where now they sell a lot of, Ghanaian commodities and that kind of thing. And besides, even some of the big chain stores are now selling Ghanaian goods, plantain, cassava, yam, and whatnot. If you went to a Giant or some of these, you can buy them there. But I believe that part of our problem is internal with regard to the organization of the purchase and the export of our commodities. We seem to have left it to the individual Ghanaian entrepreneur
to take on that task.
Yeah.
Whereas we have institutions that have been mandated to do these things.
So that makes it difficult. I recall, for instance, when I was in Japan, this gentleman who had been importing Ghanaian cassava into Japan ran into a little problem because somebody imported some cassava from the Caribbean. And it was the variety of cassava that even in this country we don't eat. It's because it's supposed to be a bit poisonous or something. But he brought that into Japan. The Japanese noticed that this was an unacceptable product. What happens? They immediately changed the chemical composition of the cassava they are prepared to accept. In the meantime, this Ghanaian had a 40-foot container of cassava at a port.
Coming into the country.
Right. So as soon as that, regulation was dropped on, it means he couldn't clear the 40-foot container. So it became a big problem, and he came to talk to me, and I went to talk to people whom I thought had responsibility to do something about it. In the final analysis, I got some kind of solution through. I was told that if I was going to limit the consumption of the cassava to people who work with me at the embassy, then there is a possibility of of releasing, the cassava. Yeah, of course, I acknowledged that, accepted that, and got the importer and the exporter I gave them some marching orders that within a certain period of time, they better make sure that the cassava is consumed, whichever way it is. But it didn't pose a problem because our cassava was all right. It's just that the importation of the other one caused a bit of concern. But you see, these are issues that come up when most of the export to other countries are handled by just individual Ghanaian business people. And most
they need
of the
experts
time,
to come on board to assist.
You do need a certain kind of backup with regard to
support,
an organized
support.
So that a case like that, you can very easily sort it out, on a larger comprehensive
without
table.
having to put the entire
precisely
on the individual.
But I think we have a lot of commodities that we can actually get onto the American market. The thing is, the American market is a big one, but then also a sensitive one, usually very well regulated, and therefore we ought to, as it were, recognize the parameters with which we are playing in, and then make sure that our goods are of the quality, wonderful presentation, because with purchases, especially when we are talking about mostly consumption patterns and such, packaging makes a lot of difference. Once the product is very well packaged, at least you get the attention, and you get the consumers to at least test it. So I know that maybe all of us have bought commodities before, which are in terms of taste and atrocious, but at least you bought it in the first instance because of the fact that it was so attractive on the shelf. And that is how we also ought to be able, not that we are going to sell any unacceptable product, but even if the product is one of the greatest, if the presentation falls short of people's perception, you aren't going to get too much sales. So again, we need to have some support for Ghanaian exporters with regard to the presentation of our products.
So this, what I pick from your explanation is that usually your office is supposed to be working with the Ghana Exports Promotion Authority and then other institutions put in place to ensure that goods that are being taken out of Ghana, the shores of Ghana, are in great shape to be exported. Is that right? So they have to make sure or guide whoever wants to do business when it comes to exporting to the United States of America. You do that all the time.
Yeah, because we attend a lot of the trade shows. So we write, reports and pieces of advice to the various ministries. The shortfall with us is that, for example, I have one trade officer, one of the hardest working and one of the most knowledgeable people I know in terms of trade promotion. But we are handling a country that is a continent, and she's one. And therefore, as hard as anybody could try, the coverage is always going to be difficult. And then also, where there are so many other organizations to deal with, she comes principally from the Ministry of Trade. Then you have export promotion. Then you have, all kinds of organizations. And sometimes you have to make sure that these organizations are at least in sync with each other.
Yes.
So that we can all talk the same language. We have had situations where my trade officer and I have gone to a certain kind of exposition for which we actually did push for some Ghanaian, producers to come. Yes, they did come, but I remember two, of them couldn't come. So their stands at the exhibition were essentially empty, and in fact, those two didn't have products there. So we got, some people who are not necessarily Ghanaian to ask to hover around, just in case there was an inquiry, then we can rush in to help. but it has a lot to do with the coordination between the various organizations in the country, and then also a certain improvement in the relationship between those organizations and the U.S. Embassy with regard to the issuance of visas for people who are bona fide traders or bona fide business people going for a trade fair, and therefore making sure that at least they get the necessary travel documents, especially after they had paid to go into these exhibitions to promote their wares. So that there's always going to be a certain necessity to have a fluid relationship among these organizations
all the parties
and the
coming
U.S.
together.
Embassy. Yeah.
Right. Your Excellency,
yes.
Let's talk. You mentioned you have expressed concern about the inability of the various parties to coordinate in putting Ghana out there when it comes to what we produce and how much we can sell to the world. You also mentioned promotion of what we can. It looks like we haven't done so much or tap into what we can make visible when it comes to our uniqueness, the things that we can also put out there for the world to appreciate. Now, what are these are more or less like the agricultural sector. Let's come to the other areas. Which other areas? This is mainly under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, right? Let's talk about the other areas of cooperation between these two countries, because I know that we take so much from them. How much do we give them? We have so much opportunity to give them if we want to. At the end of the day, we need to go through the proper channels of ensuring that our products are in the right shape or well packaged for us to take to the United States of America. What are the other areas of cooperation?
No, I believe that even with AGOA, Ghana, like a lot of the African countries, have not made significant use of it.
AGOA?
Because the kinds of goods that we can put, on the American market, I don't think we have systematically tried to promote them. And therefore, we fall short of utilizing the quotas that we have insofar as getting onto the American market is concerned. For instance, why is it that we grow so much cashew, but during the cashew season, Indians come to the rural areas to buy them, go and, treat them, package them, send some of them to, Ghana to sell at prices which are obviously, marked high for profitability. Whereas we can also package, the nuts and brand them enough for somebody to recognize, yeah, that is a Ghanaian cashew. We haven't, as it were, clued on or zeroed in on it. I now understand that there is an organization that is supposed to see to, cashew production. But then it depends on how they are going to proceed and whom, they relate to and whatnot. And then you see, when that happens, the organization, one of the first things it needs to do is to at least get, the embassy to indicate where, for instance, in the states that the highest consumption of cashew is, their sort of view on packaging, so that you take this into consideration. But I'm quite sure that, these kinds of communication, if they come at all, will come in trickles. Again, yes, we sell, plantains, all right, but most of our plantains come to smaller Ghanaian retail outlets because individuals bring them in. So the operators of these shops tend to rely on these individuals to bring their commodities in.
They could have been done on a much more bigger scale.
Precisely.
Exactly.
So, these are some of the little niggles in it. So it makes the expansion of our, export a bit slower, if not smaller. There is a guy in New Jersey at the moment. He manufactures this bread, A bread,
Yeah.
he set up, in conjunction with a Lebanese
Company.
well, the company is his.
Okay.
But the Lebanese owns a bakery.
All right.
And he is helping him bake his bread in his bakery until he is able to
Establish
break
himself.
up precisely. Now, a person like that, I'm quite sure, can do with a little bit of backing from the state. The question is, has he ever asked? But then even if he hasn't asked, I mean, we know what he does. We visited, the premises and such. So we are writing a recommendation for him to be, supported. Not necessarily by way of giving him a handout, but at least see him through the initial, difficulties in getting onto the market.
Yeah.
And at least for the time that when he already was in about 12 big-time grocery stores. So he has a potential. And if that bread is on the American market,
Shelves, you can
well,
imagine.
it makes
exactly.
a lot
that
of
is
difference.
Ghana out there.
Yeah, precisely.
I agree.
Yeah, so I don't know what kind of either training or shepherding that most of these exporters, do have. But I had started trying to make it my business for Ghanaians to establish businesses in the States.
We need that. We need
so
more
that
of
we
that.
can have that kind of face in a country as big as that.
As the U.S.
And that would obviously transfer into the other countries that we have to deal with.
Interesting. I know we do something in oil and gas as well.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, we have been trying to get, companies to invest in our oil and gas industry. Because after all, we have got a lot. But obviously, we are not going to be able to consume, all of it. And besides, if we have oil and gas, we also ought to be making, the steps to develop some kind of petrochemical industry. Because there are lots of other things we import, which I'm quite sure we can, produce here, because they are all derivatives from the, oil and gas industry. And I don't know whether the issue still is alive, but I know that a lot of our gas coming from the oil fields are basically flared off, even though we buy gas, in cylinders and whatnot. So there is that kind of area for one to deal with. Maybe the problem is the investment to go into that is difficult to come by, especially internally. But then it also means that we ought to be able to look at the industry, examine how we can make it a little easier, not necessarily cheap, but easier, because processing in this country to some extent is a bit excruciating. You may come into this country to invest.
Which you said a bit. It's highly excruciating.
Yeah, and the processing itself can depress you enough to leave.
Right.
And I can tell you
a lot of people have given up.
Yeah, there are lots of people whom I have encouraged to come, and they come and tell me some very woeful stories, and you find it very difficult to, encourage that kind of person anymore. And if you are not careful, you suddenly might end up causing people to invest time and what, because even travel is expensive these days.
Very expensive.
Yeah.